It's nice to be back from vacation. I had a couple of weeks with Brenda. It was called a staycation. You know, you don't actually go anywhere. You just are at home. And it was especially neat because normally on a vacation you try to seclude yourself. But we saw friends and got things taken care of and spent a couple days by the river. And it was really a blessing. And if you are new here for the first time, welcome. I know that I didn't hug everybody, but after the service, maybe you feel close enough to me, we can get a hug going. And in a couple of weeks, I think 2 weeks, we're going to have some missionaries come to the church to share the story of how that mission field began in Brazil, or Guyana, sorry. It is a story of miracles that involve angels. And so it's going to be very interesting. And you'll hear about some fascinating supernatural activity and things like that. So if that's interesting to you, I encourage you to try to come on that weekend. We prayed for the sermon, so I'm just going to begin with a story. You guys like stories? Yeah, I like stories. This story I heard with Robin. We have a friend who works at a toy store in the area, and he has a coworker who shared this little story. He said this woman came in, she had a little boy, and they were running through the store together, and the boy was a little bit reckless, knocked some things over, and then he made his way to the worst place that reckless little boys can go to in the toy store, and that is the marble bins. And he tottered up there, and he grabbed the edges, and he started pulling on them, and he's like looking over the counter, his eyes are dilating, like, no, slow motion, and then cascade of like Niagara Falls, marbles just on the floor, and little boy thought that was fun and continued on his way. So the employee, thinking the mom would be devastated, ran around the counter and started scooping up the marbles, and he can help if he wants to, and she just kind of crossed her arms and she said, "That's your job." His face turned red, his ears turned red, got a lump in his throat. Can you imagine the condescension, the feeling of rudeness that you would get from a response like, "That's your job. You're an employee here, you pick up the mess," Ooh, I could feel it when I was hearing this story. And a couple days later, the same employee went into McDonald's to get some lunch and realized that the person preparing the food behind the counter was that mom, that rude mom. He doesn't normally get a pop, a soda, a soft drink, whatever you want to call it, depending on the part of the United States you're from. Today was different. He said, "I'm going to get myself a soda." Ordered it, called his name, there's the tray, grabs the soda, on the counter. "I'd help you clean it up, but that's your job." He walks away. Doesn't that make you feel creeped out and sad? And I was hearing the story from a delighted person, like, that's the kind of revenge you want to get, like the rude, and I just felt sad inside. I didn't know how to respond. But that's normal human behavior. That's natural, plain behavior. You can expect that from people a lot of the time. Contrast that with this story. Bongolo Hospital is in Africa. And there's a couple policemen in the city of Bongolo who were very corrupt, I'll just put it that way. And they would bug different groups of people and manipulate them, and there'd be blackmail and things like that. And these policemen were using their power to try to force the city to do things their way. And there was a particular policeman, one of the two, who focused all of his nasty intentions toward the hospital and the Christians in the area who worked in the hospital. And they were so corrupt that the village chief, or not the village, it's a city, the officials and the people who worked for the city and a lot of the kind of just townspeople began an uprising against these two police officers. Their plan was to kill them. And so they began their attack. 2 people died. One of the city dwellers died, and one of the police officers died. The police officer who didn't die happened to be the police officer who was annoying the Christians and the hospital workers. How did he come out alive? What had happened was hospital workers, the Christians, heard about the uprising, snuck to the place that the attack was planned, and protected that police officer during the attack. He escaped with his life. They took him to the hospital, and they nurtured him back to health, shared the gospel with him. And one of the hospital employees says, God really demonstrated mercy to this man in giving him another chance. The Christians shared the gospel message with him in the hospital, and we pray that he will humble himself before God. See, that's the opposite kind of a story, isn't it? You hear one of sweet revenge, sweet so to speak, then you hear the other of this altruistic, blessing your enemies kind of a thing. And that is really a perfect living example of today's Bible verse, which is Romans 12:14. I want you to look this up in your Bibles. At the end of the pew, there should be Bibles there for you to use. And when you find it in the Pew Bible, just call out the page number so that people can look it up there with you. Romans 12:14. 1095. Thanks, Garrett. You'll see it says, bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. That is epic. Normally, when we read the Bible and we see something like that, we just kind of skim over it. You know, a lot of the time, our tendency is to try to get as much done as possible, you know, reading through these pages. And so verses like that, we don't take the time to absorb them. It's kind of like getting a plate of dinner and licking the top of the dinner one time, and that's all you get. You know, you don't dig in. You know, that's. But we're going to dig into it today. We're going to take some time. We're going to internalize this meal from the Scriptures and think about it. To our human hearts, the exhortation doesn't make sense. Exhortation is synonymous with invitation or appeal, but it doesn't make sense to us because we have that desire in our hearts to get revenge sometimes, or to hold a grudge, or to be vindictive, or passive-aggressive. There's all different kinds of ways that we get back at people, or don't let them be our friends after a time. This sermon is all about all of that relationship kind of problems that we get sometimes. When I first heard the story from the Bungalow Hospital, I thought that I was hearing a sad story. I thought that the Christians were part of the uprising. It wouldn't have surprised me because, you know, sometimes you hear about revenge stories, like I told one earlier than that about the marbles and stuff. And so I was kind of like anticipating a kind of a uncomfortable ending, but really surprised and delighted to hear the Christians had done the right thing. Though this policeman had harassed them, the Christians blessed him in return in three ways. They took care of his physical needs by nurturing him. They shared the gospel with him. And then they said, pray for him that he's actually able to have his heart softened to the point where he can accept the gospel so he can be our neighbor when he gets to heaven. Isn't that wonderful? I love the story. And that man, by the way, was surprised. Can you imagine how surprised he was? Here comes this group of people. Oh no, side attack. And then all of a sudden, he's sheltered. These are the people that I've been just being a butt to, you know, for so long. And then all of a sudden, what's going on? That's how Jesus lived. And it's from Jesus' life that Paul is teaching us here in Romans today. And it's with God's authority that he tells us how to treat those who are our enemies. I'm going to explain why I put that in quotes at the end of the sermon. Bless and do not curse. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. That is a small excerpt or a little bit of a quote from Luke chapter 6, verse 28. I'll put that up here for you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. Who said this? Anybody? It was Jesus. This is in the middle of his teaching about how to treat your enemies. And so we're going to get a lot of our sermon today from the words of Jesus. Are we okay with that? Yeah. When Jesus said, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you, he said, pray. This is very enlightening, by the way. He said, pray because it's not just your behavior that he's after. Because you might do that in your own willpower. You might sit there and not attack them back. But that's not what he's wanting from you. He's wanting your heart in it. He's wanting you to actually, when you pray for somebody, you can't have a devious intention in your heart when you're asking God in heaven to bring them into friendship with you, to do the best for their good, to rescue them in the name of the gospel. This is a heart thing that's going on. Bless and do not curse. Pray for them. It's a much bigger appeal than what you might think when you first just read, just don't retaliate against them. It's more than that. It's deeper than that. To live that way is going to require a lot of humility. And humility, let me just put a definition on that. This is a biblical definition. This is not like a dictionary definition. Humility is self-centeredness replaced by Christ-centeredness. That's humility. That's a rich understanding of how we become humble. When we take our focus off of our own desires and carnal things, and instead we are focused on what Christ wants and how he lived and taking delight in all of that, you become humble. And people around you begin calling you humble. And maybe you don't call yourself humble because you've seen how humble Christ was. And comparing yourself to that just makes you more humble, doesn't it? Paul hoped that the Roman Christians would have a taste of this. And so he put down, bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Part of a quotation from what Jesus said. These people in Rome regularly had persecution. They often were attacked, sometimes just verbally. A lot of times their families were broken up and they'd get disowned or something as they entered into the Christian religion that was spreading in Rome. And so they really needed this exhortation because a lot of times people wanted to get revenge. And so this was a very timely message for them. You would think, looking at the verse before today's verse, it was share with the Lord's people who are in need, practice hospitality, that Paul, if he was writing from a perspective that kind of made sense to a human mind, that he would say, but run from those who persecute you, set boundaries and buy some swords so those jerks don't take advantage of you. It seemed like that would make sense, in human perspective, but instead he just said, surprise them. Amaze them. That's actually the title of today's sermon, is surprise them. I think that's what they're looking for. I think that's what Jesus wants from us, is for a little surprise to be inserted into the day of somebody who thinks of you as their enemy. They're caught off guard, We're going to see that all through the rest of the sermon. That's today's message, really. It's totally upside down, radical thinking to have somebody do something painful to you and then to respond with kindness, isn't it? It's totally backwards to us. If you were illiterate in Greek and you saw these two sentences next to each other, you might have chuckled. You might have been thrilled, and some people reading it might have even sat and thought about it, maybe tearfully. What Paul does in Greek is a little different than what we see in English. There's something lost in translation. And I did some research and talked to people and stuff to try to figure out if this was legitimate, what I was reading. It turns out that dioko, the Greek word that means pursue, it also means persecution, is used almost side by side in the Greek text. There's only a couple words between. And he uses it like this. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Pursue hospitality. We have in English the word pursuit. Hospitality could be a pursuit, right? Bless those who pursue you. Bless and do not curse. This is the basic meaning of this word. And he's doing a play on words, or many scholars believe he's doing a play on words intentionally. One of the reasons is that he could have used some other words. There was three other words that specifically mean persecute, harshly control, subordinate, coerce, oppress, afflict, and harm. He could have used these words there in verse 14. Bless those who afflict you and all these things. But instead, he stuck with dioko and repeated it there, one after the other. What do you think of, I'm just going to kind of bring this into a better perspective. What do you think of when I say shooting wildlife? Hunters? Was there anybody who thought of photography? Yeah. So there's these two, I drew this last night at Patty's house with the purple pen that she gave me. There's two ways of looking at the term shooting wildlife, right? And there's two ways you can look at the term pursue. Dioko means pursue. You can pursue hospitality. You can pursue those. You can bless those who pursue you, or you can pursue blessing those who are pursuing you. And for the people living there, he could have been trying to help them, these persecuted Christians, remember the passion that their enemies had in harming them. Jews were leaving synagogues in Jerusalem and going out on search parties to kill Christians at this time. And they were passionate about it. You remember Paul's story, running around, he uses the same word in his testimony, pursuing the Christians. And now he's using it here to describe being hospitable. It's fascinating because really it's like he's saying, practice hospitality with the same vigor and passion that the Jews have in killing you. That's really powerful. That's like an extreme kind of passionate hospitality. That's a lot of kindness. Then he clarifies in the next verse, rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. At first glance, it might seem that these two are not so related to each other. You know, it kind of seems like he's jumping topic, but really there's a relationship. Rejoice with those who rejoice. If that's an exhortation, you have to realize that these people who he's just said, bless those who persecute you, might be tempted, if there was somebody who had just hurt them, if that person was in pain, to rejoice at their pain also. And so he's saying, don't smile and celebrate when your enemy is in pain. Instead, cry with them. Oh, it cuts even deeper. And then he says, and when they're happy, if you see somebody who's just killed your brother getting married, celebrate. You're holding no grudges. I see a couple of confused looks. He was saying, like a Miss America contestant, where in we used to watch that when I was little. We always said when I was little, second place is the first loser, and we'd always repeat that while they were coming up to the final round. And we were always fascinated to see how that runner-up to Miss America was going to behave when she found out that she had lost, essentially. And so we'd watch, and, oh, she's a jumper. You know, like, yeah, the ladies they're both jumping and hugging each other. This one is celebrating with her opponent, essentially, who just won. You've seen that. And then other women will just break down in tears because they lost, and they want to leave the stage as soon as possible. And it was always a thrill to me to see the one who lost willing and able to celebrate with the one. I always thought, well, she should have been Miss America, because maybe the other one would have been crying and stuff. Celebrate with those who are celebrating, even if they are an opponent of yours, because really we're all neighbors. Again, that's kind of opposite of how we would normally behave. It's easy in a baseball game when your team loses to be sad, but you know, they always in the Little League teach the kids to give each other a high five at the end of the game because it was all a game anyway, you know. So how do we change? How do we switch over from the normal way of thinking to God's way of thinking? From harming, from cursing those who are our enemies, are persecuting us, treating us poorly, to blessing them, and not just on the outside, but blessing them all the way from our hearts, so we're willing to pray for their good. And what do you pray for? You pray for their good now and forever. How do we make that transition? Well, the answer is, and has always been, to behold Jesus. To delight in the way that he lived. By beholding him, we are changed, aren't we? Jesus taught us to surprise people. I like surprise. Anybody who likes surprise? Just give me a little hand raise. Do you like surprises? Some of us are kind of iffy about surprises because people have done a poor job surprising us, so we've learned to fear surprises. But in general, people, if there's a surprise party, I had a surprise party one time, Brenda was able to pull it off so that I walked into the house and it was kind of dark. And I thought maybe Brenda was gone. And then the lights came on and everybody was there and they all yelled surprise. And I involuntarily almost wet myself. I was totally amazed and delighted at this group of people who apparently loved me enough to come together and do the surprise party. I liked that surprise. And Jesus is inviting us to have similar, like lots of small moments like that for the people who would expect it the least. That's cool. So I'm going to read Jesus' whole teaching on how to treat your enemies, but I'm going to emphasize that surprise aspect. I don't think I've ever heard somebody preach emphasizing the aspect of the element of surprise in this passage before. I want you to follow along. So look up in your Bibles, Luke chapter 6, verse 21 through 36. This is cool. I'm excited to be able to talk about this verse today because it's just so interesting when you look at it from this perspective. So get a Bible and look at it for yourself. Luke chapter 6, verse 21 through 36. Actually, you know what? We're going to start in verse 27. But to you who are listening, I say, now not everybody's listening. So I ask you right now to be part of that group of people who's going to listen to this. That's your choice. If you're listening, listen to this. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Now, if I was back there sitting on the side of the hill where Jesus was sharing this, I would have been like, whoa, wait a second. We've always been taught if somebody slaps you, you slap them back. If somebody knocks out your tooth, you take one of theirs. If somebody, whatever, takes an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, right? So that's what they're used to hearing. And then Jesus comes along and says, no, erase that. Mind's blown. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. This is verse 28. Pray for those who mistreat you. That's where we got our verse earlier. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. We're going to look at what that actually means in a minute. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them either. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Whoa, this is going a little too far, Jesus. This is like Christ-like behavior, right? Do to others as you would have them do to you. That is so radical, it's hard for us to comprehend. If you really, really let this play out in your life, identity theft would be very different, wouldn't it? Or not being able to pay your credit cards. Imagine them sending you a letter saying, actually, we realize you probably can't pay, so you're forgiven of that debt. Can you imagine that happening? Wow. Our society would be so different. I would love this. I would rack up lots of debt. No, I'm just kidding. By the way, verse 31, I used to totally abuse that verse with my sister. Do to others as you would have them do to you. We'd have the sibling rivalry. We'd be poking each other, and stuff like that in the back seat. If Aaron poked me or pinched me or something, I'd say, do to others as you would have them do unto you. You must want to get pinched. And we'd retaliate with this is in the middle of a verse that talks about blessing instead of harming those who just, so that's not how we're supposed to interpret the verse. Verse 32, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? This is another kind of uncomfortable topic because you say, well, I do love people. I do bless people. I put other people before myself. But what credit is that to us? We get no points for doing that because listen to what he says. Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Wow. Oh, man. That's totally different than how we think. On a deep down, foundational level, there's something very different happening in Jesus than what we're used to in our lives. And I want that. I want that in my heart. Because I want to surprise people, and I want people who think they're my enemy to be my neighbors in heaven. And that's some of the difference that can be made when we really listen to it and take it to heart. Did Jesus practice what he preached? This is what he was preaching. Did he practice it? He had a number of different kinds of enemies. I actually mapped out 11 or 12 specific genres of motivation that people had for afflicting him with things. I'm going to share just 9 with you. The other ones were a little too abstract to be easy to explain in a short amount of time. So Jesus encountered prideful people, didn't he? I'm just going to tell you verses. I'm going to read verses to you without the verse to go with it. So just listen and recognize the verse and kind of let your brain's familiarity with the Bible try to complete the story. Where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works? This is pride again. Is this not the carpenter's son? Is not this his mother called Mary and his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? And his sisters, are they not with us? Where did this man get all these things? So they were offended at him. So they began to be enemies of him just because they thought, this is the kid next door. What can we learn from him? Have you ever encountered somebody, and maybe your family or something, where you had this spiritual idea or this fact, and you wanted to share it with them, but they didn't want to hear it because they thought they already knew more than you, or they seem so knowledgeable and they kind of like strut around with how much spiritual knowledge they have. That kind of thing happens, and sometimes you end up with your feelings hurt because of that attitude. Jesus experienced that. And how did he respond? He was really kind to these people. He spent the next 3 years gently trying to teach them, parable after parable. If you have ears, listen. And finally, he had to resort to some very loud and whip-wielding methods to try to get their attention. But at first, he took all the time he needed to try to teach them. He was very gentle. As we think about these enemies of Christ, I want you to be thinking of the same kind of genres of people in your life and recognize that Christ understands the pain that you feel. These different prideful, fearful, tradition lovers, etc. So the fearful, we could also call them the weirded out. You have faith, and they go, I don't know. They kind of feel strange around you. There's something about this faith thing that makes them uncomfortable. Good example of this. When they came to Jesus and saw the one who had been demon-possessed, this was from our sermon last week, and had the legion, remember, legion of demons in him, sitting and clothed in his right mind, they were afraid, skipping over a verse, then they began to plead with him to depart from their region. I don't know, Jesus, that was neat, but, just can you please leave? Plus our pigs are dead. The whole thing made them uncomfortable. You might experience that same kind of thing when you're sharing your faith, or when you decide to get baptized or whatever. Then there's people who love tradition. Jesus encountered a lot of this. Behold, there was a man who had a withered hand, and they asked him, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? That they might accuse him is the next phrase there. So Jesus encountered this tradition, and there's so many times that we encounter tradition in our lives, in the church, and when we start trying to step aside from the tradition to go swimming on the Sabbath or there's all kinds of things. I could get into that. There's a whole sermon waiting there about tradition. But we encounter that sometimes, and I almost left the church when I was younger because I wasn't wearing a tie. And some elder pulled me aside and he said, you really need to dress up for God. And I recognized at the time the tie was just a tradition, And I was injured by that. I was only 12. So you'll run into that sometimes. And Jesus certainly did. Was he kind to those people? Did he bless those people who were traditional? Oh, yeah. Yeah, he was willing to forgive them and heal them and teach them and be their God and give them eternal life and all kinds of things. He blessed them beyond their wildest dreams. The selfish. Jesus was encountered by a lot of selfish people. Judas was one of them, just one example. Jesus said to him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" Judas had in his pocket 30 pieces of what? Silver. And Judas was trying to manipulate the circumstances, try to get Jesus forcibly onto the throne of Israel so that Judas there could be at his right hand and hold a position of great honor and power. And so he was trying to manipulate him because of his religion. I have two pastors that are in my past that pastored me, and both of them at different times had somebody come to them in the parking lot in malls and say, they had some kind of meeting arranged, I guess. If you're really a faithful guy, if you really believe in God, then you should have the faith necessary to give your wallet to me for an hour, and I'll give it back. And then I'll believe, and I'll just start coming to your church. And so I really do believe in God. So they give their wallet to this guy. This is a true story, two true stories, not two, that's four. And they give it to him, and then he leaves, and he doesn't come back. And they have to cancel all their credit cards, and they lose this cash and their ID and everything like that. I mean, interesting decision, pastors. All I'm saying is there's people out there that will try to take advantage of your religion to harm you. We're talking about those people too today. And Jesus was a blessing to Judas as well. He washed Judas's feet in the Last Supper, didn't he? He was willing to forgive him. In fact, he was so generous with his attitude toward Judas that Judas said, I need to take justice into my own hands, and he went and killed himself. Then there's the jealous. As you change because of God, people might not like the new good name that you're earning, the new friends that you're getting and things. Pilate answered them and saying, "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" For he knew that the chief priests had handed him over because of envy. There's a verse for you. These guys were just really uncomfortably jealous of all the attention Jesus was getting. Wanted him out of the picture so that they could take back the reins, so to speak. You might run into people like that. Those under pressure. Pilate himself, who was trying to avoid killing Jesus in all of this, including a dream that his wife had that told him not to. He was between a rock and a hard place, and so much pressure overpowered him. I have found no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go. But they were insistent, demanding with loud voices they be crucified. And the voices of these men and of the chief priests prevailed. So Pilate gave the sentence that it should be as they requested. Can you imagine the pressure and the pain of that moment for Pilate? Turning himself into an enemy of Christ. And Christ then suffered from a new kind of enemy, people who responding just out of pressure. And then Pilate, being a Roman there, gave orders. And so there were people who were just following orders, making themselves enemies of Christ, putting him on the cross and all of that. They didn't probably care much about Jesus, but he was somebody who needed to be crucified, so they became enemies that day of Jesus. And what did he say to them? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Was Jesus a blessing for them as well? Absolutely. All of Jesus' enemies, and I can give you many more examples, all of Jesus' enemies, he responded to by trying to bless them, by being somebody who was more than generous with his love toward them. And we can learn from that. In every situation, he treated them well. And today, one way that Jesus touches the hard-hearted, one way that Jesus touches those who are cold, is by the surprising warmth of our responses to them. One way that Jesus touches the cold-hearted is by our surprisingly warm response to what they do to us. That's one of the ways he knocks on the doors of their hearts and gets their attention. Does that mean that we place ourselves into harm's way? No, it doesn't. Does it mean that we should suffer abuse? No, it doesn't. If your husband is beating you, you get out of that circumstance. If you see somebody stealing, you don't bless them by not turning them in. You see, abusing us isn't a blessing to our enemies. They might think it is. But deep down, when you look at what a real blessing is, being allowed to hurt somebody isn't a blessing. Does that make sense? And so that's why it's not okay. That's why turn the other cheek doesn't mean stay in a marriage where you and your kids are getting battered, for example. We bless them by ministering to their needs, by thinking about, working for, and praying for their best interest. Does that make sense? We bless them by surprising them with kindness when we have the ability to curse them. That's what turn the other cheek means. And it's the message of the rest of chapter 12. And I'm going to go through the rest of this chapter. We're going to look at the surprise aspect. And this might be the last sermon in this chapter 12 series. I also might go into a couple of these verses and do another sermon. I'm not sure yet. Romans chapter 12, verse 14 through 21. We're going to go through that together right now. So please turn there in your Bibles if you aren't. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. We have talked about that. Verse 15 says, rejoice with those who rejoice, like the Miss America thing, and weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind toward one another. In other words, try to get on the same page. Do not set your mind on high things. Don't go pursuing the nice threads and the sweet job and the car and the house and everything, and refuse then to, hug people who need a hug because they smell different than you do. And by smell, I'm using that metaphorically and in the normal sense of the term. If you're refusing to hug a homeless man because your clothes are nice, you're the person who should be hugging him because you probably have, a place to wash those clothes if it needs to be washed for some, Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. In other words, get real. If this is news to you, then you've got a lot to learn. Don't try to think of yourself as the educator of everybody else. That includes me. So don't think that I'm up here thinking, I'll figure it out. I'm not thinking that. So let's all of us together realize we've got a lot to learn. Is that okay? Repay no one evil for evil. This is verse 17. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. That's another interesting little challenge. When it comes to being at a party and everybody's doing something or disagreeing with something or voting for somebody, you want to kind of fit into that situation, but you have a different set of beliefs. We're not trying to be so friendly with them that we're willing to cut down our own morals to agree with them. We're willing to stand out and to continue to bless them with another perspective. If at all possible, as much as it depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Verse 19, beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. What an interesting sentence. There's a place for wrath, isn't there? But not if you take it up with yourself. So give place to it. That makes sense when you read the next phrase. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the who? Lord. The Lord. Therefore, it's cool that the word therefore is right there. God's going to take care of justice, so if your enemy's hungry, feed him. You don't need to be the one to do justice. This gives you freedom to be able to respond lovingly to them right now. If your enemy is hungry, feed them. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap coals of fire on his head. Now we go, all right, there's where they're in pain. That's how we get them. That's not what fiery coals means, though. That term comes from metalworking. And when they used to purify gold, anybody know how gold's purified? You heat it up so much that the different kinds of metal that have different densities separate from one another, kind of like water and oil on the top. And different metals have these different weights. All the stuff you don't really want aluminum and tin and copper and things like that, would raise to the top of this liquid gold mass, and they'd tilt the crucible a little bit, and the gold, everything but the gold would be spilled off the top, and the gold would remain there. Problem was, sometimes gold, little bits of it would get trapped up in the copper and the tin because it was in contact with the air. This is a very technical description, I understand. It was in contact with the air, and it cooled it down so the convection and the freedom of the different kinds of elements wasn't. This is so technical. I didn't realize it was going to be so technical. They needed the top to be hot, so they put coals on top of it. I'll just say it that way. Burning coals on top of it, and what it did was allowed the gold to drip down into the rest of the gold mass below. What I'm trying to say is, or what he was trying to say with this term was, if you treat your enemies well, you will bring out the best from them. If you treat your enemies well, you will bring out the best from them. This has happened to me. I'll tell you a story in a second. Do not be overcome by evil, verse 21, but overcome evil with good. Elijah stood next to his master, Ichabod. Elijah was a slave man. And Ichabod was pretty upset. The sun was beating down. The rainy season was just around the corner, should be about a week away, and they still had so much cotton to pick that the plantation looked like it had barely been touched. And Ichabod said, "Do we need to whip them harder, Elijah?" Elijah was kind of the head slave, the one who took orders from the English speaking to the different African languages speaking. He was the one who tried to keep things organized and make sure the fields were harvested. And so Ichabod had his arms crossed, kept spitting on the ground. He was frustrated because he didn't believe he was going to get the full profit from the plantation that year because they were just moving so slow. How do we get them to work faster? And Elijah said, well, they're not like machines that don't mind the sun. They slow down. We're going to need more men. Ichabod brought him to the top of a hill where there was a hut built for shade and for breaks and things like that, and where you could see all the different fields in the plantation. And he said, "We still have all these fields from the property we bought last year." And Elijah said, "We had the same number of slaves last year, and we barely made it last year. And you bought all these extra fields. How do you expect us to work this year? Well, what are you going to need? You're going to need more slaves. How many more? Probably 20." They talked a little bit longer, and narrowly avoiding a potentially violent situation, Ichabod agreed to buy more slaves so that they could finish the harvest. The next day, they were at the slave market, and Ichabod was walking up and down with Elijah by his side, and he said, "Elijah, you pick out these guys to do all this extra hard work, because you're the one responsible for making sure that we got all the cotton in this year." And so he started going around pointing, how much is this one? $75, $80, $50, that kind of thing. And they picked out probably 15 slaves. And they walked up, and there was this old man there. And Elijah pointed at him, and he kept on walking. And Ichabod said, whoa, wait a second. He's old. He's not going to be able to do anything. He's so weak, and he's going to die soon. Elijah just said, "Told me to pick who I wanted." And the slave, the trader, he said, "Well, since you're buying 20 slaves, I can throw him in for free if you'd like." Ichabod said, "I like the price of that." So 21 names were registered there, and they walked back to the plantation that day. Elijah explained the work to them, got them working, and took a few extra minutes with this old man. Ichabod thought, maybe it's because Elijah's become a Christian. When Elijah had first entered the plantation, he was really bitter. He had just got off the boat from Africa. He was angry. He took out his anger on all kinds of destructive ways. Ichabod thought that he had been whipped into submission finally, but really he realized the other slaves on the plantation were sharing the gospel and talking about respecting your masters if you're a slave and things like that. And so Elijah dramatically changed over that period of time. And so Ichabod thought maybe he's just trying to be nice because he's a Christian. He went home that night, he complained about it to his wife, and she said, well, I think he's really nice. He helped the little girls get their bags of cotton into the wagons and things. So just leave him alone. And as the week began to pass, Ichabod noticed that Elijah was treating this old man especially well, almost to the point of annoying him again. He would stay up late into the night under candlelight making new clothes for the old man. And he made him a cotton mat for his bed and kept him in his own hut and things. And he even began showing up a little bit late to work. But he worked harder than ever. He got everything done. He was helping people move the wagons and helping the water boys even get the water out to everybody. And so he didn't really mind that much. But one day, it was lunchtime, or lunchtime was over. Elijah was still not back. And so he went looking for him, went to his hut. And he is still blinded from the excruciating light. It was already a week past the time the rainy season was supposed to start. You know, he still had sun, so that was good for the work. But walked in, and his eyes were trying to adjust to the dim light of the hut. Elijah, you in here? I am. I am, sir. What are you doing? He said, I'm just cooling down this old slave's face. He's real sick. Why are you doing that? Well, you need to be out working. His eyes began to adjust. You could see him with a wet washcloth dabbing the face of this poor old man. It really looked like he was going to die maybe in a couple of days. He was just so frail, barely able to move, laying on his mat that Elijah had made him. And he said, why do you care so much about this old man? He's going to die anyway. He's worthless. Well, I love him, sir. Why do you love him so much? Is he your brother? No, not my brother. Is he your father? No, not my father. Is he a friend of yours? No, he's my enemy. What do you mean? This is the man who is my worst enemy, sir. He's the man who abducted me as a child, put me on that boat. The Bible tells us to love our enemies. I'm just doing what Jesus asked me to do. Ichabod was so moved that he stumbled from the hut. He had to go home and sit down on the edge of his bed. Gave him something to think about the rest of the day. He let Elijah have as much time as he needed to take care of this old man who eventually died, but who had received totally undeserved blessings from somebody who he had totally cursed earlier in his life. That's what turning the other cheek is. This sermon, Jesus' teachings, and we looked at them, and we saw how he treated his enemies. We beheld Christ, essentially. We looked at what Jesus has, the kind of lifestyle that he had. He surprised people with undeserved blessings. He surprised people. But Satan is very clever, isn't he? And Satan has devised 3 stumbling blocks that frequently creep into our hearts to stop us from thinking that it's possible. 3 stumbling blocks that might make us say things like, Christ lived a beautiful life, but blessing those who persecute me is just too hard for me to do. If you're having that response right now, I'm going to address these 3 stumbling blocks as we close, so that you can be free of them and free to love like Jesus loved, and like Jesus moved Elijah the slave to love the man who had captured him as a little boy to sell him to the slave traders. The first stumbling block is a lack of perspective. Maybe you've lost track of exactly how much you've received from God. If you truly appreciate Christ's mercy, you will love being merciful. Remember, he died for me. He died for you. Totally undeserved blessing. Romans 6:5 even says, while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. How can we receive that gift and then curse somebody else as if they weren't eligible for God's kindness? How can we do that? Lack of perspective. Roald, you can come forward if you'd like. The second stumbling block is misguided justice. We think that, they made me suffer, so it's just right that they would suffer, at least as much as I suffered. There's justice that needs to take place. The problem is when we take that into our own hands. You probably remember how in Romans 12, it says, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord." Jesus died for us. He gives us immortality. Therefore, our persecutors, those who would like to trouble us, cannot hurt us ultimately. We will live forever. So there's no reason for us to have the last word here on earth. God will, right? So we'll leave that to him, and we are free to be a blessing to them. It's going to happen. If they reject salvation, they will get their comeuppance. They'll get what's coming to them. The third stumbling block. Some people are enemies. Some people are enemies. That's actually not true. We don't have enemies. The Good Samaritan, when he found that Jewish victim, the muggy, out there laying in the dust, blood caked on his face, did he say, "That's my enemy, I'm not going to touch him," or did he call him a neighbor, right? And Paul, right here in the verses that we looked at today, he said, treat persecutors as persecutors should be treated, right? No, he didn't. He said, treat your persecutors like your neighbors. You don't have enemies. No, in reality, no one is your enemy. They're our neighbors. So we should treat them that way. You say, but Jesse, the Bible calls people our enemies. It says, treat your enemy like that. No. They call them our enemies so that we can even understand what they're talking about. An enemy, biblically, is somebody who thinks you're their enemy. You don't respond that way. They're your neighbor. Every human holds an invitation to eternal life, don't they? Every human, I want you to say yes if you agree, every human holds an invitation to eternal life, don't they? Yes. So every human could potentially be your neighbor in heaven, couldn't they? You're beginning to see things the way Jesus sees them? Who requested his crucifixion? Who hammered the nails into his hands? His enemies? Jesus said they don't know what they're doing. And friends, Jesus is not at war with the human race. He's at war for the human race. Jesus is not at war with the human race. He's at war for the human race. Who is the real enemy here? Ephesians 6:12 says, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. That's the truth about who our enemies are. So don't be fooled. You might have neighborhood feuds. You might have marital arguments, and Satan is trying to fool you into thinking that you're at war with each other, that you're wrestling with each other, but actually you're both wrestling against him, and he's trying to prevent you from realizing that he's there. That's what's happening in an argument, in a neighborhood feud, in a family disagreement, whatever. Satan's trying to pretend like he's not there, trying to put up a barrier. One of the most powerful things that happened in our marriage, Brenda and I, is when we stopped arguing halfway through an argument, and I think we both thought at the same time, we're not enemies. We feel like we are. Satan's fooled us into thinking that we are, but we're not, right? Yeah, we're on the same team, right? Yeah. Well, let's stop arguing and pray instead. That began to change how we met each other in conflict. That's so powerful to realize that Satan wants to try to fool us into thinking that way. Don't be fooled. Paul taught we aren't fighting with flesh and blood. So if it is flesh and blood that you're encountering, you're not at war with it. You're not fighting with flesh and blood, so if it's flesh and blood, you're not fighting with it. We fight against the devil, and we don't stand a chance, do we? Unless we have divine help. And Jesus offers us the stunning advice for us to bless those who persecute us, to bless and do not curse. When you get cut off on the highway, don't give them the finger. Give them space. Surprise them, right? Stop trying to give people driving lessons while you're in your car. Besides, the guy that cut you off, he might be your neighbor when you're in heaven, right? When your neighbor plays loud music, when somebody flips out on you at work, when somebody makes fun of your faith, surprise them. If you will think in that painful moment, you're about to be totally surprised by Jesus. If you'll think that, then you're bringing a taste of heaven to them, and you're putting burning coals on their head. You're going to bring out the best in them. A couple of years ago, I criticized Brenda for something. I don't remember what it was. It was insignificant. I was really rude about it. I said, you're always, I don't know what it was. She did something terrible. She turned to me. Without saying anything, she got closer and closer and closer, and then she kissed me on the lips. I felt horrible. I felt terrible. Have you ever seen The Little Mermaid? Anybody seen The Little Mermaid? You know those little green things that live in Ursula's cave? I felt like one of those. It brought out the best in me. It transformed me there on the spot. And we both realized Jesus did that. It totally transformed the situation. And it was a huge blessing for us. To give me a kiss. The root of radical Christ-like love is death to human nature, plus an unbreakable delight in the surprising way that he lived. Amen? I'll say that one more time. The root of this radical Christ-like love is death to human nature and unbreakable delight in the surprising way that he lived. If you can read the Bible and say, man, that is cool, the way that Jesus did this, and see how he handled that situation, that's really, I just wish I could do that, then your heart is changing. You are being changed as you're having that emotion. If you struggle with bitterness, if you struggle with revenge, go deeper with Christ until you know him and you love him the way he really is. Thank you.